This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. This is where Carius earns his oak leaves. Let's begin. On the morning of July 24th, a day I'll never forget as long as I'm alive, I was with the 4 tanks resupplying at the headquarters company. Major Schwanner had also shown up. Once again, we briefly discussed the operation as I conceived it. In accordance with the plan, the Tigers under the command of Lieutenant Eichhorn were supposed to move through Dinneberg and wait for me at the edge of town on the Rollbahn to Riga. I wanted to drive ahead to reconnoiter the terrain and then meet my people at the agreed-upon place. I still remember exactly how the battalion cook prepared a favorite of mine, cucumber salad, which I hadn't had for a long time. Major Schwanner jokingly said to me, "Carius, don't eat so much, that's not good for a stomach wound." As he had done so often before, the commander also threatened that he would punish me if something should happen to me during my cruising with the Volkswagen and motorcycle. Fortunately, neither of us knew how right he was that time. This day would mean contact with the enemy in the truest sense of the word. Unfortunately, the last running Volkswagen in my company was disabled. I therefore moved out with the medic's motorcycle and sidecar. The medic himself steered. This vehicle didn't bother me. I had never believed in superstition. I also wouldn't have been any better off with another vehicle. There was also an incident that wasn't without its comic side. In the early morning hours, the driver of my Volkswagen Kubel had come running up to me out of breath. He excitedly told me that he had been knocked out by a Russian anti-tank gun. The motor was destroyed, and he had left the vehicle standing on the Rollbahn. It would have been very unpleasant for me if he had really been right. I then carefully drove back the 2 kilometers, dutifully staying on the alert, and waited for the first hit that the anti-tank gun would deliver. Nothing stirred, however, and we were finally in front of our Volkswagen. I carefully got out to see from which side it had been hit. I couldn't find any penetration, however. A puddle of oil on the ground led us to solving the puzzle. A piston had penetrated the oil pan. The bang in the middle of the night had shocked the poor guy so much that he only thought he was hit. He disappeared in a flash. That could even happen to an old vet. Nobody needs to be embarrassed if sometimes something similar should happen to him. The worst thing about the entire matter was that my last Kubel was out of commission. Riding the motorcycle, I drove through Dinneberg and then northwest on the Rollbahn to Riga. After a journey of about 8 kilometers, we turned off the road to the northeast and went through a few small villages. We crossed a railroad track and then had the wooded terrain in front of us. It extended north of Dinneberg from west to east as far as the Dinneberg-Rossitten Rollbahn. There was nothing to be seen of the Russians far and wide. En route, I met Oberleutnant Wolf, who led the battalion's reconnaissance platoon. He had just come back from the woods and had covered the same route that we intended to do, but in the opposite direction. I asked him to wait with my tanks, which had probably already arrived at the northwest outskirts of Dinneberg. For the evening, I invited him for some sauerkraut and dumplings, his favorite meal, which my mess personnel had promised me. This invitation possibly saved my life, a fact which I wasn't to discover until later. If his Kubel had not been available, I wouldn't have reached the hospital in time. Riding on the motorcycle, we then drove east into the woods until the Dinneberg city line. We turned south and reached the anti-tank gun that formed our boundary on the extreme left of the front, but which didn't have contact to the right. At first, however, the men who were covering to the north assumed we were Russians. They recognized us, thank God, just in time. I briefly explained to the commander of the piece what we intended and that we would soon assume positions to the left of him. If we intended to pull back to Dinneberg, I would inform him. In the meantime, it had become afternoon, and I had returned to my tanks on the Rollbahn. I took along both of the Tigers, which had set up for security about 2 kilometers north of the road. The tank commanders were Eichhorn and Göring. The other 2 tanks followed, and we then drove the same way that I had previously reconnoitered with the motorcycle. We had to cross over a few small bridges after we had turned off the Rollbahn to the northeast. These planked bridges were so short that they held even our tanks. Only one of them was too long. Fortunately, however, we found a ford and finally got to the railroad line without incident. The trains were backed up there, some of them with wounded, and everyone wanted to go to Riga. The line was completely blocked, however. The railroad men were already preparing to leave the trains because they thought the Russians were approaching. They already imagined that they had heard a few shots. When they saw our tigers, they calmed down again somewhat, especially when I assured them that they could wait with confidence, at least until the evening and our return. Perhaps they could continue then with their trains. They did, in fact, actually succeed in getting away by train later. I had a man from the reconnaissance platoon placed at each of the bridges we passed because all of them were already prepared for demolition. The engineers weren't there anymore, by the way, but it would have been easy for anyone to light the fuses before we had returned. I wanted to avoid that at all costs. The engineers had been very active everywhere. They had even turned around the signs in the hope that Ivan would perhaps drive the wrong way. That would succeed with the Americans in certain situations on the Western Front later on, but certainly not with the Russians. We crossed the railroad tracks and approached the village where I wanted to set up my tanks. From the northern edge of the village, we had woods in front of us about a kilometer away. We could cover everything superbly until the night fell. I wanted to drive back to the Rollbun at night after a decent-sized salvo of fire. That was so the Russians would think that we were still there. I stopped as I approached the entrance to the village. It was a small village, whose street in the center made a right-angled turn toward the northwest and continued as a field path. Something or other didn't appear to be right to me. People sometimes get a sort of sixth sense in extraordinary situations in their lives. I looked over the houses with my binoculars and found it strange that there wasn't one person to be seen on the street. The women were gaping behind the windows, however. A boy came running up to me from the village, and I stopped him. I asked the boy in my terrific Russian, "Ruski soldat suda?" Amazingly, he immediately answered, "3 kilometro." How could he know that so well? I had just come through there a few hours before, after all, without noticing one Russian soldier. Lieutenant Eichhorn pleaded insistently with me to drive behind both of the tanks with my motorcycle, because everything also seemed strange to him. Despite that, I drove into the village in front of both of the tanks and directed them into position at the northern edge. I had left Feldwebel Kirscher and Unteroffizier Kramer, the latter in my Tiger, to pull security at the turnoff at the Rollbun to Riga. They were supposed to wait there until we came back at the onset of darkness. Nothing stirred far and wide. I drove along the field path on my motorcycle toward the northwest. I wanted to observe the terrain better from some high ground and survey the woods some more. I saw the roof of a farmhouse peek out from behind the high ground. It was to the left of the road. We had passed it a few hours before during our reconnaissance run. We drove just up to the high ground, where I ordered a halt. I then engrossed myself in my map board to orient myself on the ground. Suddenly, my driver shouted, "Russians in the farmhouse!" They were already firing. I glanced to the left and shouted out, "Turn around!" Loki, the driver, killed the machine, a 700cc Zundap. Everything else happened as fast as lightning. We jumped from the motorcycle. Loki reached the ditch intact, but a shot shattered my left thigh. Crawling, we attempted to get back to the village, but my strength soon left me. I ordered Loki to scram and alert Lieutenant Eichhorn, but the loyal man didn't want to leave me in the lurch. He drove me even crazier with his remarks that Ivan was coming closer and closer. Every time we raised our heads over the edge of the road, the Russians fired like crazy. I shouted out Eichhorn's name again and again as if he could have heard me, but people do many senseless things at such moments. Despite my wound, I slowly crawled on as best I could. The Russians, however, came closer and closer. They certainly hadn't noticed our tanks because they couldn't see into the village from the farmhouse due to the high ground in between. I had also lost my map board in the meantime. My ever-present field cap had already fallen off during the jump into the ditch, a bad sign. Marwitz, who found it later, saved it as a talisman through the long period of his Russian captivity. In the meantime, the Russians had crossed it over the road and into our ditch. Every time we moved, they fired. The bullets whizzing past me didn't hit Loki either because he was covered by me. In the end, he got away with a flesh wound. I intercepted the other rounds. I received a shot that penetrated through my upper left arm and another 4 hits in the back. Because the many wounds, especially those in the back, were bleeding heavily, I was soon completely exhausted and didn't get any farther. When we didn't move anymore, the shooting stopped. Suddenly, my rapidly dwindling will to live was revived. The engine noise of my tanks could be heard clearly, the sound of salvation to my ears. Eichhorn and Göring had heard the shooting and moved out to see what was going on. In addition to my elation, my hopes were revived that I would get out of that fix alive. But then death suddenly stood in front of me. 3 Russians had approached our rear and suddenly surfaced 3 meters behind me. I will never forget that sight for the rest of my life. I was bleeding from my many wounds, had no more strength, and heard the engines of my Tigers, which were probably coming too late after all. Like an animal shot in the belly who sees the hunter coming and can no longer escape, I looked around me. A Soviet officer stood in the middle. He called out, "Ruki Verch! Hands up!" The soldiers to his right and left held machine pistols aimed at us. It was fortunate that the Russians were still afraid that I could get the dumb idea to shoot. The same thing would have probably happened to me in his place. He had no idea at all what state of mind I was in. Nothing was further from my mind than shooting. I couldn't think at all at that moment. It would have been impossible for me to draw my weapon since I was lying on my healthy right arm. My tanks came racing up then. With machine guns firing wildly into the area while on the move, they didn't hit anything. The sudden appearance of the Tigers naturally gave the Russians a shock. Both soldiers ran away immediately, but the Soviet officer raised his pistol to finish me off. In my condition, I didn't desire to look death in the eye. I turned toward my approaching tanks. That was my good fortune and my salvation. The Russian pulled the trigger 3 times, but he was so excited that 2 shots went wide and only 1 hit. The round went extremely close to the spinal cord in my neck, but miraculously not one tendon or artery was hit. So it didn't turn out to be a bullet in the head after all. I was amazed that I was still alive. In any case, if I hadn't turned toward my Tigers, the shot would have gone through the larynx and these lines here would never have been written. Quite literally, my comrades had arrived at the very last second. Lieutenant Eichhorn rolled on past me, while Oberfeldwebel Göring immediately stopped next to me. I am not capable of expressing the wonderful feeling of security that filled me then. The thought didn't even enter my mind that something could possibly happen to me during the continued shooting. Stabsgefreiter Marwitz, Göring's gunner, swung out of his hatch in the turret and landed with a leap in the ditch next to me. He hardly knew where he should start to dress me or apply tourniquets. After all, I was bleeding everywhere. The overalls that I was wearing were just rags. Marwitz unfastened his suspenders and firmly tied off my thigh above the wound. Fortunately for me, these suspenders were of top quality and elastic. Otherwise, I would have lost my leg due to the tourniquet. Afterward, I was often asked whether I had felt pain. No one could imagine how I really didn't feel anything at all as a result of the excitement and the exhaustion through the large loss of blood. I was just pleasantly tired and also afraid of losing consciousness. I perceived the bullets only as blows against me and not at all as pain. When the leg was tied off, Marwitz propped me up from behind onto the rear deck of the tank. Even today it remains a mystery to me how I got up there at all. I then actually stood behind the turret, one leg hanging loose in the air. I hung on tightly to the edge of the turret. Suddenly, on top of everything else, there was more shooting from behind. It was then clear to me why no Russians had been seen before in the village. A few Ivans had already ventured up to the houses and were surprised by us. When faced with the tanks, they preferred to remain completely under cover, but then they came to life. I called out to Göring to traverse the turret to the rear. He reacted so quickly that he jammed my unscathed foot between the turret and the hull. Because of that, I came within an inch of having permanent injury inflicted on my unscathed leg. Even today, I can't understand why not even one shot hit me while I was standing exposed on the rear of the tank. And shortly before, while dismounting the motorcycle, I had to receive an immediate hit. We fought our way back through the village and reached Oberleutnant Wolf on the outskirts. With clever foresight, he had waited with his Kubel outside the village. By doing so, nothing had happened to him. They then put me, as best they could, in the rear seat of the vehicle. I once again ordered Lieutenant Eichhorn to immediately drive back to the road, just as we had already discussed. He was to blow the bridges, where our people stood as guards and awaited our return. Unfortunately, Eichhorn didn't follow my order. When the Kubel finally moved and I knew I was finally saved, I collapsed completely. I was completely bled out and could only talk softly. Wolf came from Pirmasens, which was only 24 kilometers from my hometown. He held my head in his lap and boosted my spirits. I could only whisper, "Tell my parents how everything was, and that I couldn't do anything to prevent it. I feel like it's just about all over for me." Wolf also didn't believe that I would survive the trip, as he later wrote me. But I came home healthy, however, while my comrade died a soldier's death in East Prussia shortly before the end of the war. I didn't come back to my senses until they wanted to transfer me to a medical vehicle. By then we had long crossed the Duna. I deeply regretted that I had not been able to say goodbye to Kirscher and Kramer. The people attending to me had also dispensed with driving me by the battalion, as I had desired to do before my evacuation. Of course, it didn't occur to me why they took everything so seriously as they hurried along. In my misery, I also didn't receive anything to drink, although I had a terrible thirst after my large loss of blood. The conscientious medics were afraid, however, that I could have a stomach wound. Today I have to agree with them, but back then I cursed up a storm. I had been wounded around 8 p.m. and regained my senses at the main dressing station around 1 a.m. Even today I see Hermann Wolf dashing about like a madman looking for a doctor. After Wolf had finally found one, the doctor determined that my leg probably couldn't be saved because it had been tied off for so long. Fortunately, however, blood began to circulate again after half an hour, and no artery had been damaged. I was thus able to keep it. The doctor gave me a shot of morphine. When I woke up again, I was the prisoner of a cast. With the exception of my right arm, my right leg, and my head, nothing could be seen of me. I felt more than uncomfortable. I then received another blood transfusion, after which I noticeably revived. It should be noted that the donor was also someone from Pirmasens. He also wrote me later in the hospital. Like a package, they placed me in the barracks. All the beds around me had been filled with the severely wounded. When I saw the suffering of these comrades who continuously moaned in agony, I felt, besides compassion, deep gratitude that I had got off relatively well. I didn't feel any pain at all. I had enjoyed unbelievably good luck in that the many shots had not penetrated any nerve endings. I was able to talk in a coherent fashion with the minister who made his rounds in the morning. The first one to visit me the next day was my commander, Major Schwanner. Tears welled up in both our eyes when we saw each other again. I then made my report, contact made with the enemy. When he saw me, he even forgot to chew me out because of the motorcycle, which was now in the junk pile. It was then that I had to say farewell, the most difficult farewell of my life up to then. Of course, I talked some rubbish about how I would soon be back in the company again. Delzite believed even less than I did that I really could keep that promise. As a consolation, the battalion adjutant brought some news along for me. After our big success, the Corps headquarters had turned in my name for the oak leaves. I wouldn't discover until back home that this report wasn't just a consolation. My condition improved noticeably during the day. I noticed this change because I got an urge for a cigarette. The doctor, who wanted to deny me the cigarette, remarked that I had been shot in the lungs, something which strictly ruled out smoking. I continued to plead, however. It was precisely through smoking that I could prove that my lungs were in order. In case my lungs had been penetrated, the smoke would have to escape out of the wounds in my back. The medical man couldn't deny my logic. My persistence in begging had probably convinced him that things were looking up for me again. I continued to grumble about my fate, however. I simply couldn't understand why I had to get shot right then, when my fellow soldiers needed me so much. On the day I was wounded, of all days, I had officially been named company commander by battalion order. Unfortunately, the pleasure of receiving that post had been of short duration. At first I was supposed to be flown back to Germany in a Storch, but there were so many soldiers who needed the transport more urgently and sooner than I did. I was thus in the main dressing station for another 2 days. During their daily visits, my comrades reported all the news that had happened to our unit. They told me that Lieutenant Eichhorn had not moved back on that night, and that on the next day he had let himself be misled into frontally attacking a village which was occupied by strong Russian tank forces. Of course, he had been repulsed. Eichhorn was a superb officer, but he still lacked the necessary experience. He had only been in the company for a short time after he, a former paymaster, had voluntarily attended the school for armor forces. The men also related how he had only reached the Rollbahn, which Ivan already controlled with his tanks, to Riga with great difficulty. The unit had run the gauntlet between Stalin's and T-85s. Only one Tiger had reached the bridge over the Duna, which was already under enemy fire. Our company had more casualties dead and wounded on this one unlucky day than in all previous operations. The men who could get out, the last one in the company. Oberfeldwebel Delzeit appeared after Major Schwanner. I felt how difficult it was for him to keep the truth from me. I then knew for certain of their burning tanks had to swim across the Duna to get to safety. Our company never recovered from this severe bloodletting. Nienstedt and Eichhorn were soon wounded, and new officers arrived who weren't so close to the troops. Major Schwanner was also later replaced by a commander who was a complete failure. The rest of our tanks were farmed out individually and were lost one after another. With a heavy heart, I went back to the homeland. I was loaded on a ship in Reval. The Russians had already broken all rail connections. After 14 days, I arrived in Germany. In Swinemünde, we were put on wonderfully clean hospital trains. For the first time in a long time, I lay in fresh, white sheets, almost too good for a common soldier such as myself. When I arrived in Lingen on the Ems, I weighed all of 87 pounds. At that time, I didn't believe I would be making my first attempts at walking by the end of September. It was in the hospital that I first read in an old newspaper that a fellow soldier had brought with him that I had been awarded the Oak Leaves on July 27, 1944. I was the 535th soldier of the Wehrmacht to receive that award. This concludes the 23rd part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.